My promotion bonus isn't yours to spend, Colin. I said it in the middle of the corporate parking lot in Dallas, rain sliding down the windshield beside us, while my husband smiled at my boss and replied, "It was just a family transfer. Relax." 10 minutes earlier, I had discovered he wired my entire $15,000 promotion bonus to his mother. And now my CEO was staring at the telematic screen in his car, watching my company vehicle leave the lot. Driven by someone who didn't even work there. My husband. My liability. My career. One sentence from my boss cut clean through the rain. "Emma, do you know where your car has really been going?" I looked at Colin. He froze. And in that second, something inside me stopped pleading, and started calculating. If stories about quiet strength and hard-earned clarity speak to you, stay with me. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to that morning, before I understood what my marriage had really become. That morning, I had no idea anything was unraveling. It was Monday, and the air already carried that heavy Texas humidity that settles into your clothes before breakfast. I remember smoothing the front of my blouse in the hallway mirror, noticing how the fabric finally fit the life I had worked for. Director of Marketing. The word still felt formal, almost borrowed, like something I was careful not to smudge. The bonus had cleared on Friday afternoon. $15,000. I had stared at the number longer than necessary, not because of the amount itself, but because of what it represented. 12 years of early mornings. 12 years of staying composed in rooms where I was often the only woman. 12 years of volunteering for projects that required patience more than praise. Colin had wrapped his arms around me when I showed him the deposit notification. "You earned this," he had said, pressing his chin lightly against my shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Linda was at the kitchen counter that morning, steeping herbal tea in one of my white ceramic mugs. She always chose my mugs. The ones I had bought slowly, one at a time, after we were married. She smiled at me over the rim. "You're blessed, Emma," she said softly. "A supportive husband makes all the difference." I believed her. Colin offered, again, to handle the finances so I could focus on settling into the new role. He said promotions came with pressure, and pressure required clarity, and clarity required someone steady at home. "Let me take that off your plate," he insisted. It sounded thoughtful. Responsible. I handed over the login details without hesitation. Marriage, I thought, was built on shared access. At 7:30 a.m., I left the house feeling taller than usual. The new company Camry still smelled faintly of factory plastic and clean upholstery. I remember placing my hands on the steering wheel and taking a quiet breath before pulling out of the driveway. For the first time in a long time, I felt visible in a way that had nothing to do with being someone's wife or someone's daughter-in-law. The drive to the office was ordinary. Traffic lights. Morning radio. A man in a pickup truck cutting too sharply into my lane. Nothing felt ominous. Nothing suggested that by noon I would be standing in a parking lot defending my own integrity. When I pulled into the executive section of the lot, I noticed the space assigned to me felt symbolic. Closer to the building. A small detail, but one I had earned. I parked, gathered my bag, and walked inside with the kind of quiet pride that does not need witnesses. The first meeting of the day went smoothly. A presentation review. Some budget approvals. A few polite congratulations from colleagues who had once competed with me. I kept my composure steady, my voice measured. It wasn't until mid-morning that my assistant appeared at my office door. "Emma, facilities called. They're asking about your vehicle." I frowned. "What about it?" "They said it's not in its assigned spot." I assumed a mistake. Perhaps I had parked one row over in my distraction. I walked back outside, heels clicking against the concrete, scanning the rows. My space was empty. I checked the neighboring rows. Nothing. A faint discomfort rose in my chest, but I dialed Colin anyway, expecting a simple explanation. Oh, he said casually. I needed it for something quick. I'll bring it back. Needed it? The word lingered longer than it should have. Company vehicles weren't favors. They were logged assets. Insured. Tracked. I ordered a rideshare, telling myself not to overreact. While waiting in the back seat, I opened my bank app out of habit, thinking I might transfer a portion of the bonus into my savings account before lunch. That was when I saw it. Wire transfer. $15,000. Recipient, Linda Hayes. For a few seconds, I did not understand what I was looking at. The numbers felt abstract, like placeholders. Then the meaning settled. The air inside the car shifted. My palms grew cold. The driver asked if the temperature was comfortable, and I nodded without hearing him. At 7:30 a.m., I had been a woman stepping into her new life. By 10:15 a.m., I understood that something inside my marriage had been moving quietly without me. And I had just caught up to it. The first real strike wasn't the wire transfer. It was my boss turning the tablet toward me in the parking lot and letting the evidence speak without raising his voice. Rain dotted the screen, blurring the edges of a digital map threaded with red lines. Each line began neatly at our office building and ended in the same place. Riverside Downs Casino. 3 separate routes. 3 different evenings. Long stops. Engine idling for hours. 3,000 unauthorized miles in the last month, my boss said evenly. Fuel card charges flagged twice. GPS override requests approved under your credentials. My credentials. The phrase felt invasive, like someone had entered my office and rearranged the furniture. I didn't authorize anything, I replied carefully. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, but steady. Colin shifted beside me, one hand still resting on the car door as though this were an inconvenience, not a crisis. It's not what it looks like, he said, smiling too quickly. My mom's been under stress. The casino helps her unwind. We always returned the car in perfect condition. We. That word settled between us like a confession. Company vehicles weren't recreational favors. They were insured corporate assets, tied to compliance systems, liability structures, and executive accountability. If there had been an accident, if someone had been injured, every report would have traced back to the assigned director. Me. Not Colin. Not Linda. I imagined a collision report. An insurance claim. A deposition. My name printed in black ink across documents I had never consented to. That wasn't embarrassment. That was exposure. My boss didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. That was worse. Emma, he said quietly, this is compliance territory. Altered logs are serious. Altered logs. I turned to Colin slowly. Did you override the mileage entries? He hesitated just long enough. I adjusted them so they wouldn't flag unnecessarily, he said. It was temporary. Temporary fraud. Temporary risk. Temporary use of my authority as if it were household property. The rain grew heavier, sliding down my collar, soaking into the fabric of my blazer. I barely felt it. Instead, I felt clarity. The bonus transfer. The car. The fuel card. My passwords. None of it was impulsive. It required planning. Access. Confidence that I would not challenge it. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, though I already understood the answer. Colin's expression shifted from charm to irritation. Because you overreact. I was protecting you from unnecessary stress. You just got promoted. You don't need distractions. Protecting me. By risking my position. By using my login credentials. By transferring money I earned without consent. I saw it then, not as isolated acts, but as a system. Linda's doctor appointments. Her sudden interest in the fuel card. The evenings Colin insisted he needed the car for something quick. The way he positioned himself between me and any financial conversation, calling it partnership while quietly centralizing control. I had mistaken secrecy for care. They were not the same thing. My boss straightened slightly. We'll need to escalate this internally. IT will pull access logs. Compliance will review the overrides. HR will likely request a formal statement. Colin's jaw tightened. That seems excessive. No, my boss replied calmly. It seems necessary. There was a silence then, heavy, undeniable. For years, I had absorbed small discomforts to preserve harmony. I had ignored the flicker of unease when Linda cried at every boundary. I had reframed Colin's control as leadership, his interference as involvement. Standing there, watching red lines glow on a rain-streaked screen, I understood something else. They had relied on my reluctance to make noise. They had relied on my desire to keep peace. They had relied on my dignity. I looked at my boss. I need to file a formal incident report, I said clearly. Immediately. Colin stared at me as if I had just betrayed him. You're choosing a corporation over your family? He asked, incredulous. No, I answered calmly. I'm choosing accountability. The word felt foreign in my mouth, not because I didn't believe in it, but because I had not applied it at home. For the first time since I married him, Colin looked uncertain. Not afraid of losing me. Afraid of losing access. And that distinction, quiet, sharp, undeniable, was the first true warning that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a breach. And breaches, if left unaddressed, become habits. My hands began to shake in that parking lot the same way they had the first night Linda arrived with her suitcases. It wasn't dramatic then either. No shouting. No spectacle. Just a quiet knock at the door and Colin's voice asking me to be patient. She stood in our entryway holding two large navy suitcases, her lipstick slightly smudged, her shoulders drawn inward as if the world had narrowed around her. They raised the rent, she said softly. I have nowhere to go. I remember the smell of rain that evening too. Dallas storms have a way of flattening the sky, making everything feel smaller than it is. I stepped aside without asking how much the rent had increased. Without asking whether she had searched for alternatives. Without asking how long she intended to stay. Colin didn't look at me when he carried her bags to the guest room. He kissed the top of her head instead. We'll figure it out, he told her. That night, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of someone else moving in my kitchen. The cabinet doors opening. The soft click of porcelain against the counter. I told myself it was temporary. Temporary has a way of settling into permanence when no one defines its edges. Within weeks, the grocery bills doubled. The refrigerator, once neatly organized, became crowded with items I didn't buy and rarely used. Herbal teas in glass jars. Expensive vitamins. Snack foods I wouldn't have chosen. The utilities rose too. Longer showers. Television humming late into the night. Lights left on in rooms no one occupied. When I mentioned it gently, Colin sighed. Don't be cold, Emma. She's family. Family. The word was always positioned like a moral test. Linda cried easily. She spoke about sacrifice, about raising Colin alone, about the years she went without so he could have what he needed. She described herself as fragile, as though stability were something she held together by sheer will. Colin became her rescuer. And slowly, without noticing, I became the resource. It began with small requests. Could I borrow the car for my doctor appointment? She asked one afternoon, folding her hands politely in her lap. Of course, I said. The company vehicle felt like a symbol of my progress, but it also felt abundant. Generous. I saw no harm in sharing. Then the requests became assumptions. I'll take the car this afternoon, she would announce, already reaching for the keys. Colin began managing my schedule around her errands. She needs it more than you do, he would say. You're at the office all day anyway. I started ride-sharing more often than I drove the car assigned to me. At home, subtle shifts occurred. Linda began commenting on my tone, on my posture, on my hours at work. "You look tired," she would observe. "Stress doesn't suit you." When I set boundaries, small ones, she cried. "She thinks I'm a burden," she would whisper to Colin. And he would come to me later, quiet but firm. "You're too intense, Emma. She's sensitive." Sensitive. I learned to edit myself. I reduced my questions. I softened my concerns. I told myself generosity required flexibility. But generosity without reciprocity becomes extraction. Looking back, the pattern is obvious. The emotional choreography. The way discomfort was redirected toward me until I apologized for feeling it. In the parking lot, rain sliding down the edge of my collar, I remembered the first time Linda asked for access to my laptop. "Just to check the electric bill," she said. "You're so busy." "I don't want you to worry." I gave her the password. It seemed harmless. I did not know I was handing over more than a login. I was handing over trust without guardrails. Colin watched me now with that same familiar expression, defensive, protective of her, mildly disappointed in me. As if I had failed a kindness test. But kindness without boundaries is not virtue. It is vulnerability. And standing there, watching my professional credibility hang in the balance, I understood something I had refused to articulate for a year. This had not started with the casino. It had started the night I convinced myself that love meant silence. The first time I met Linda, she brought a lemon pie balanced carefully in both hands. The crust was golden, the meringue tipped in soft brown peaks. She wore a pale cardigan and a smile that felt rehearsed but warm enough to disarm me. When she hugged me, she held on a second longer than necessary. "I've heard so much about you," she said, tilting her head slightly. Colin finally found a woman strong enough to keep up with him. It sounded like praise. At dinner that evening, she told stories about church bake sales and school fundraisers, about how hard it had been raising Colin alone. She described nights spent sewing Halloween costumes by hand and mornings waking before dawn to pack his lunches. Her voice trembled at the right moments. She laughed lightly when recalling struggles, as if resilience were her defining trait. If there were warning signs, they were delicate. Polite. Easy to overlook. My neighbor, Mrs. Carver, noticed before I did. She caught me at the mailbox one afternoon not long after Linda moved in. "Be careful," she said quietly, glancing toward my house. "Your mother-in-law isn't as helpless as she looks." I smiled politely, almost embarrassed. "She's just adjusting," I replied. "It can't be easy." Mrs. Carver's expression didn't change. She simply nodded and walked back across the street. I dismissed it. Kindness, I believed, required trust. The red flags didn't arrive dramatically. They accumulated like dust, barely visible until sunlight hit them. Linda began with small, reasonable requests. "Could I borrow your laptop for a moment? I just want to check the electric bill. You work so much, I don't want you to carry everything alone." "Of course," I said. She asked for the password once. I gave it to her without hesitation. I did not consider that access creates familiarity, and familiarity creates opportunity. Then came the subtle adjustments. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets because efficiency matters. My spices were moved. My baking sheets relocated. Even my coffee mugs were arranged differently. "It flows better this way," she said gently. I told myself it was harmless. But it wasn't about organization. It was about authorship. The house had always reflected my rhythm. My systems. My quiet preferences. Now it reflected someone else's. Linda began commenting on my hours. "You look tired," she would say softly. "Stress doesn't suit you." She would study me when I returned from work, as if assessing damage. Once, I overheard her in the living room with Colin. She pushes herself too hard, she murmured. I worry about her stability. Stability. The word unsettled me. That evening, Colin approached me while I was loading the dishwasher. Mom thinks you've been tense lately, he said gently. She notices things. Notices what? I asked. You snap sometimes. You seem overwhelmed. I replayed the week in my mind. Meetings. Deadlines. Normal fatigue. Nothing extraordinary. Yet doubt slipped in quietly. Had I been sharper than usual? Had my tone shifted? Linda cried the first time I asked her to let me know before using the company car. Her hands trembled slightly. I don't want to feel like a burden. The word burden hovered between us like an accusation. Colin pulled me aside later. You could be softer, he said. She's sensitive. Sensitive. If I suggested she contribute to groceries, she grew quiet and wounded. I thought we were family, she whispered. Family always functioned as a moral shield. Colin invariably believed her interpretation of events. If she misplaced an item, someone had moved it. If she felt slighted, someone had intended it. If she was upset, someone else had caused it. Usually me. One evening, I came home to find my small desk moved from its place near the window into a dimmer corner of the living room. It felt cluttered, Linda explained pleasantly. This looks cleaner. I looked at Colin. He shrugged. It's not a big deal. But it was. Because my desk had been my anchor, the place where I paid bills, reviewed contracts, wrote notes to myself. Relocating it without asking felt like a quiet erasure. Over time, the pattern became more defined. Linda praised me publicly, my work ethic, my ambition, my strength. Privately, she questioned my emotional balance. She gets so intense, she would sigh to Colin. I worry she'll burn out. Burnout became a word he repeated. Maybe you should let me handle finances, he suggested one evening. You're carrying too much. It sounded like care. But gradually, I noticed decisions happening around me rather than with me. Fuel card receipts managed without discussion. Insurance papers shifted into a different drawer. My laptop occasionally warm when I hadn't used it. Each individual act was defensible. Reasonable. Together, they formed a quiet transfer of control. Linda never confronted me directly. She maneuvered emotionally. She cried at the right moments. She retreated just enough to appear wounded rather than strategic. And Colin stepped naturally into the role of protector. Just let it go, Emma. So I did. Again and again. Until the day red lines illuminated a rain-streaked screen in a parking lot. Standing there, I saw the architecture clearly. Charm. Fragility. Narrative shifts. The subtle framing of me as unstable when I objected. The careful positioning of her as vulnerable and him as mediator. It had not started with the casino. It had started with authorship, who controlled the story of our home. And I had surrendered more of it than I realized. That was the build-up. The casino was simply the first time the red flags became impossible to ignore. Back in the parking lot, the rain had softened into a thin mist, but the air felt heavier than before. My boss held the tablet between us without speaking. He didn't need to. The evidence was precise. Look at the timestamps, he said quietly. I leaned closer. 3 separate evenings. All after 7 p.m. All logged under my credentials. The vehicle remained stationary at Riverside Downs Casino for hours at a time. One visit had lasted nearly 6 hours. The engine had idled long enough to trigger a fuel anomaly alert. 3,000 unauthorized miles. Fuel card transactions linked directly to my executive account. Manual mileage adjustments entered at 11:43 p.m., 12:17 a.m., 1:06 a.m. Not mistakes. Corrections. Someone had intentionally overridden the system to avoid flags. Colin stood beside me, his posture composed, but his breathing slightly shallow. "You're interpreting this the wrong way," he said. "It's not like the car was damaged. Nothing happened. Nothing happened." The phrase echoed strangely. I pictured the alternate versions of nothing. A minor accident. A pedestrian. A DUI stop. A news headline. My title attached to liability reports. My boss's voice remained level. "Company vehicles are insured corporate assets. They are not family transportation. If there had been an incident, Emma would be legally responsible." Responsible. The word settled differently now. Colin shifted tactics. "We can reimburse the mileage," he said quickly. "We'll pay for the fuel. This doesn't need to escalate." We. He was still framing this as a household budget adjustment. He still believed consequences could be negotiated privately. He did not understand, or refuse to, that this had already crossed into corporate compliance. "IT will pull access logs," my boss continued. "They'll review every override. HR will request written statements." HR. That meant documentation. Documentation meant permanence. I felt something inside me clarify. Not panic. Not hysteria. Structure. Colin leaned closer to me, lowering his voice so my boss couldn't hear. "Emma, think about what you're doing. My mother doesn't deserve to be dragged through this." Dragged. The language was careful. Emotional. "This isn't about her comfort," I replied evenly. "It's about my liability." His jaw tightened. "You always escalate when you feel out of control." There it was. The familiar narrative shift. Not fraud. Not deception. My instability. For a moment, the old reflex flickered, the instinct to soften, to preserve harmony, to absorb blame in exchange for peace. Then I looked again at the red lines on the screen. The careful timing. The deliberate overrides. The confidence that I would never confront it publicly. He had counted on my reluctance. He had counted on my silence. "I need to file a formal incident report," I said again, this time louder. My boss nodded once. "We'll start immediately." Colin's expression changed. The charm drained away, replaced by something sharper. "You're choosing a corporation over your family," he said. "No," I answered calmly. "I'm choosing accountability." The word felt unfamiliar in our marriage. We had negotiated emotions. We had negotiated boundaries. We had never enforced consequences. My boss paused before heading inside. "Emma," he said quietly, "is there anything else I should know before we proceed?" The question lingered between us. This was the moment where I could still protect Colin. I could frame it as confusion. Miscommunication. Oversight. I thought of the wire transfer. $15,000. No conversation. No permission. "Yes," I said slowly. "This morning, my entire promotion bonus was wired to his mother without my authorization." Silence spread outward. Rain tapped lightly against the pavement. My boss absorbed the information without visible reaction. "Understood," he said. We began walking toward the building. Colin did not follow immediately. Instead, he caught my wrist. "Emma," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Once this starts, you can't undo it." I looked at his hand around my wrist, not aggressive, but possessive. "I know," I said quietly. And I realized something else. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. We entered the lobby. Fluorescent light replaced gray sky. Conversations hummed in the background. The elevator doors slid open with mechanical indifference. As they closed between Colin and me, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing access. And that distinction told me everything. Escalation isn't always loud. Sometimes it is simply the moment a woman stops protecting the people who have been quietly endangering her. By the next morning, the whole situation had moved beyond me. It wasn't a private argument between spouses anymore. It wasn't even a workplace misunderstanding. It had become an internal compliance case with a number assigned to it, a folder created for it, and people in quiet shoes walking briskly down hallways with my name on their lips. HR asked me to come in early. The conference room on the 4th floor always felt too cold, even in summer. The long table was polished to a shine that made faces look slightly distorted in the reflection. A pitcher of water sat untouched beside a stack of forms. Someone had placed a box of tissues near my elbow as if they expected tears. I found that insulting. My boss was there. So was a woman from compliance, a man from IT, and an HR representative who spoke in a measured tone that made every sentence feel final. Emma, the HR rep said, "We're going to review vehicle usage logs and access credentials. This is a fact-finding meeting." Fact-finding. As if the facts were buried. IT mirrored the telemetrics data onto the wall screen. The map appeared first, red lines branching out like veins, starting at the office and terminating at Riverside Downs Casino again and again. Then came the timestamps. Then the mileage discrepancies. Then the overrides, each one entered through the portal linked to my assigned executive credentials. And then the security footage. The camera angle was from the fueling station across the street from the casino. It wasn't cinematic. It was grainy, indifferent footage. But it showed enough. A man stepping out of my company car. My company badge still hanging from the mirror. Colin. He swiped the corporate fuel card with the casual ease of someone who had done it many times. He entered the PIN without hesitation. He pumped gas. He checked his phone. He climbed back into the driver's seat as if he belonged there. The room went silent in a way that made the air feel heavier. My boss's voice broke it, low and controlled. "Colin Hayes," he said, turning slightly toward the doorway. I hadn't realized, until that moment, that Colin had actually come. He stood just inside the room, hair neatly combed, hands in his pockets like a man arriving for a routine meeting. His confidence looked rehearsed, something he had put on like a clean shirt. "Yes," he answered, still trying to smile. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from disbelief. Even now, even with evidence projected 12 feet wide, he believed he could charm his way through. The compliance officer didn't raise her voice. "Did you authorize non-business use of this company vehicle?" she asked. "And did you submit mileage overrides under an executive credential that does not belong to you?" Colin chuckled lightly, as if the question were exaggerated. "Let's not make this sound criminal," he said. "I was helping my wife. We're married. It's shared resources." Shared resources. As if my career were a shared pantry. The HR rep's pen hovered over her notes. "This is not a marital asset," she said evenly. "This is a corporate asset assigned to an executive role. The assigned user is accountable for compliance." My boss clicked to the next slide. Fuel card charges. Casino timestamps. A final screen, an access log showing the mileage portal entered from our home IP address at 12:17 a.m. on the nights those overrides were made. Colin's smile thinned. The room waited. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Simply waited, the way systems wait for truth. He didn't confess. But he didn't deny it either. His gaze flicked once toward me, sharp and resentful, as if I had staged the entire thing to humiliate him. As if he were the victim of my insistence on reality. My boss exhaled slowly. "Colin," he said, "you are not an employee here. You accessed a corporate asset without authorization, falsified compliance records, and exposed the company, and Emma, to liability." Colin opened his mouth, then closed it again. The HR rep spoke quietly, reading from procedure. "Effective immediately, your access to company property is revoked. You are to return all keys and corporate cards in your possession. Security will escort you out." Security. The word landed like a door closing. Colin's face drained of color. Not because he felt remorse, but because the charm had finally met a wall that did not respond to tone. He took the keys from his pocket and placed them on the table with a small, metallic clink. That sound was strangely satisfying. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And in that moment, surrounded by witnesses and policies and undeniable proof, I understood something with quiet certainty. The story Colin and Linda had been telling about me, too sensitive, too intense, too unstable, would not survive fluorescent light and documentation. Not anymore. The house felt different that night. Not louder. Not quieter. Just rearranged in some invisible way, as if the air itself had shifted its loyalty. When I unlocked the front door, the faint scent of Linda's lavender detergent drifted toward me. Underneath it, something metallic, the quiet residue of confrontation. Colin was sitting at the dining table, elbows planted, fingers interlocked tightly as though he were bracing for impact. Linda stood at the kitchen sink, staring into it without running water, her posture rigid. No one greeted me. The clock on the wall ticked with exaggerated clarity. Finally, Colin looked up. "You humiliated me," he said. "Not I'm sorry. Not I made a mistake. Humiliated." I removed my blazer slowly and hung it over the back of a chair. The small domestic movement steadied me. "You exposed yourself," I answered evenly. Linda turned then, her expression already softened into practiced injury. "Emma, how could you let strangers speak to him like that?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough. "He was only helping me." "Helping?" I studied her face, the slight downward tilt of her chin, the moistening of her eyes. For a year, that performance would have dissolved my resolve. Now it looked rehearsed. "Helping would have involved asking," I said quietly. "Helping would have involved consent." Colin stood abruptly, chair scraping against hardwood. "It was just mileage," he snapped. "You're acting like I committed a crime." "It was falsified compliance records," I replied. "Under my name." He began pacing, running a hand through his hair, the same gesture he used when arguments did not follow his script. "You chose them over us," he repeated. "Over family." Family. The word had once felt sacred. Protective. Tonight it sounded transactional. "I chose my integrity," I said. Linda pressed a hand to her chest. "You've changed," she whispered, as if I had transformed overnight into someone unrecognizable. Perhaps I had. Or perhaps I had simply stopped bending. Colin's voice lowered, losing some of its sharpness. "You could have talked to me first," he said. "I did," I answered. "In the parking lot. You told me to relax." He flinched at that. Silence settled again. No one mentioned dinner. No one asked how the investigation concluded beyond the spectacle of it. Their concern centered only on consequence, not cause. I walked into my office and closed the door gently behind me. The lamp cast a steady circle of light across my desk. My notebook lay open where I had left it that morning, a list of campaign ideas half-written. The ordinariness of it felt almost tender. I sat down and allowed myself a long breath. The guilt I would normally feel after conflict did not arrive. Instead, there was space. Not comfort. Not relief. Space. For the first time in months, I was not negotiating reality inside my own mind. I knew what had happened. I knew it mattered. And I had not minimized it. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Colin stepped into the doorway. His posture had shifted, less confrontational, more strained. "HR will document this," he said. "Do you realize what that means?" "Yes," I replied. "It follows you." "I'm aware." He watched me carefully, as if searching for regret. "You didn't even hesitate," he added quietly. I considered that. Inside the conference room, I had felt fear, but not doubt. "No," I said. I didn't. Something flickered across his face then, not remorse, but recognition that the dynamic had changed. I was trying to keep things stable, he said after a moment. Stable for whom? I asked. He didn't answer. That silence revealed more than any defense could have. Later, when I lay in bed, I noticed how large the mattress felt. Colin kept to his side, rigid, turned slightly away. Linda's door remained closed down the hall. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. I stared at the ceiling and replayed the day. The red lines on the screen. The metallic sound of keys placed on the conference table. The look in Colin's eyes when security stepped forward. It hadn't been shame. It had been surprise. Surprise that I had not absorbed it. Surprise that I had not protected him. And in that realization I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not triumph. Release. For a year, I had carried the weight of preserving harmony. Tonight, for the first time, I allowed that weight to fall where it belonged. Not on me. 2 weeks later, the internal review concluded. It was brief. Clinical. Efficient. HR called me into the same fourth-floor conference room, though this time there were fewer people present. The compliance officer summarized findings in a tone that suggested finality. Unauthorized access to a corporate vehicle. Falsified mileage entries. Improper use of a company fuel card. Non-employee involvement. Each phrase felt detached from emotion, stripped down to fact. My boss spoke last. Emma, the investigation confirms you did not authorize the activity. Your credentials were accessed externally. IT has secured your accounts. There will be no disciplinary action against you. No disciplinary action. The relief I expected did not come as a rush. It arrived as steadiness. He folded his hands on the table. There is one more matter, he continued. We've been considering expanding leadership in our Denver branch. It's a larger operation. Higher visibility. Greater autonomy. I understood before he finished. This would be a relocation, he said. Director-level oversight. Increased salary. Fresh infrastructure. Fresh. The word settled gently. He did not mention my marriage. He did not need to. Opportunity often arrives disguised as consequence. I asked for 24 hours. That evening, I sat alone in the living room. Linda had retreated into quiet martyrdom. Colin avoided eye contact, speaking only when necessary, his voice measured but strained. The house felt smaller now. Not physically. Structurally. I noticed things I had ignored before, how Linda's suitcases still occupied the guest closet. How my desk remained slightly angled away from the window where it had once stood. How many decisions in the past year had occurred around me instead of with me. Colin finally spoke. Are you happy? He asked, not angrily, almost curiously. Yes, I answered. He seemed surprised. You blew everything up, he said quietly. No, I replied. I stopped absorbing it. We did not argue. There was nothing left to debate. The next morning, I accepted the relocation. Denver. Higher salary. A company-issued Jeep registered solely under my name. Autonomy written directly into the contract. When I told Colin, he stared at me as if trying to determine whether I was serious. You're leaving? He asked. I'm advancing, I corrected gently. Linda's reaction was sharper. So this is punishment? She demanded. No, I said calmly. This is alignment. Within 3 weeks, my belongings were packed into labeled boxes. I moved methodically, not angrily. I left furniture behind, items purchased during a version of myself that no longer existed. On my final evening in Dallas, I stood in the driveway and looked at the house. It had once felt like proof of success. Now it looked like a structure I had outgrown. 3 months later, settled in Denver, I drove past a bus stop outside a discount grocery store near my new apartment. I wasn't looking for them. But I saw them. Colin stood with his hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly rounded. Linda stood beside him, speaking animatedly, her gestures sharp. They looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Circumstantially. The light turned green. For a fraction of a second, I considered slowing down. But I didn't. I drove forward. No rearview mirror glance. No hesitation. Not because I felt bitterness. Because I felt clarity. Reward, I have learned, does not always look like applause. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like your name on a contract that no one else can access. Sometimes it looks like a vehicle registered solely in your own name, parked outside a home that belongs only to you. And sometimes, it looks like the quiet understanding that when someone treats your success like a family ATM, it is not love. It is entitlement. And entitlement, once recognized, no longer deserves your silence. When someone treats your success like a shared wallet, it isn't partnership. It is entitlement dressed up as family. For a long time, I confused sacrifice with love. I believed that being generous meant being silent. I thought endurance was maturity. But endurance without boundaries slowly erases you. Walking away did not feel dramatic. There were no slammed doors. No final speeches. Just paperwork, distance, and the quiet rebuilding of my own life. Some names and identifying details have been changed for privacy. Not to protect them, but to protect what remains dignified in me. If you've ever had to choose between protecting your career and protecting someone who betrayed your trust, I understand how heavy that decision feels. Tell me, have you ever reached a moment where you stopped pleading and started calculating? And if stories like this resonate with you, stay. There is power in listening to women who choose themselves, even quietly.